Today's COVID update is brought to you by Fulltech Systems, your technology center, where you'll come for the price, but stay for the service.
And welcome back to Open Your Eyes. We are now moving into our first segment on this lovely Wednesday morning. It is our what we refer to as our COVID-19 update, and with that, we are about to venture off into a topic of the 2020 Atlantic hurricane season. Now, in to tell us more, we've got Carlos Fuller, who is the International and Regional Liaison Officer for the Caribbean Community Climate Change Center. Mr. Fuller, good morning.
Good morning, and you're one of the few people who get the name of the institution correct.
Oh, you know, we try it every so often, sir. We try it every so often. But I'll tell you what, just listening to your voice reminded me of back in the days of radio broadcasting. And when we turned that microphone on for the Met service, it was Mr. Fuller.
Yes, indeed. And those were some exciting times, June to November, indeed.
Definitely. So the 2020 hurricane season, Atlantic hurricane season is here. And so far we've seen, and this is out of the season actually, because it starts from June all the way to November, 1st June to end of November, but there was already a storm for this year. Let's venture off into the season and what's there to expect of it.
Well, indeed, as you said, the hurricane season actually started a bit earlier than we expected this year. Arthur forming just near the Bahamas. But in fact, this was the 5th year in a row that this has happened. And in the past, we have actually had to shift the hurricane season earlier and earlier over the past few decades because of this occurring. So indeed, this may signal a trend to something indeed that we have to change in the not too distant future. But coming to this hurricane season, indeed, all the indicators are that once again, we will be having a very active hurricane season. These are the predictions coming out of the U.S. Weather Service, out of Colorado State University, who really launched this seasonal prediction decades ago, out of the European centers. So indeed, it does seem that we're going to be having an active hurricane season this year. That is more than we normally get. Normally, we get about 12 tropical storms, of which 6 become hurricanes and 3 become very strong hurricanes, categories 3, 4, or 5. This year, we expect more than that.
So explain to us how these predictions are made. How do scientists decide whether or not it's going to be an average, above average, or below average season?
Well, there are various systems in the atmosphere and in the ocean that would trigger the formation of a hurricane season. And we now have computer models that predict what those conditions are, what they are right now and what they look like in the future. So among these, for example, is whether we have an El Nino or a La Nina. This year, we are in a neutral phase, and it is likely that we'll go into a La Nina later on the year. If we have an El Nino in the Pacific, that means that usually leads to less hurricanes than normal in the Caribbean. Neutral, it's average. La Nina, when it's cooler in the Pacific, the Caribbean is a bit warmer and you get more. So it's towards that part of it. Okay. Secondly, we have very warm sea surface temperatures, and we know hurricanes get their energy from the sea. So the Caribbean and the Atlantic Ocean are warmer than normal. We also have an enhanced West African rainy season. And when that occurs, you have more vigorous tropical waves leaving the African continent, moving across the Atlantic, and those also trigger hurricanes. And then we have a less vertical wind shear than we have that we normally have. Now, wind shear is how the wind changes with either direction or strength, and as you move from the surface up into the upper atmosphere. If you have strong wind shear, it cuts off systems from forming in the vertical. While if the wind shear is small, then the clouds are able to form very deep, and then that triggers the hurricane. And then finally, our trade winds are weaker than normal. If you have very strong winds coming in from the Caribbean, again, that tends to tear things apart. But if the trade winds are weak or tending to become weak, again, that leads to more hurricanes forming. So with those 5 factors coming into play, it does seem this year is going to be an active year.
Now, there are two things. So we can say whether or not it's going to be active or, as the prediction is for this year. But there's also the specific area that activity is expected. Sometimes I know that you'd say this time of the year it will happen more in formation more in the Gulf, in front of the Caribbean, or further out. So what are the indicators saying for now?
Well, indeed, in the early part of the year, hurricane formation tends to occur in the western part of the Caribbean Sea, in our area. And that's because the waters are warmer and we still have lingering cold fronts in the region through the Yucatan that would be a trigger for something to form at the tail end of one of these very weak fronts at this time of the year. So that is one aspect of it. And then again, later in the year, going into October, November, again, the Western Caribbean becomes the area favorable for formation. And those, in fact, are the trickier ones because you're going from a transition from tropical to the winter season, and that's when systems tend to be very erratic. During the middle of the year, that's when you have your typical big hurricanes coming across the Atlantic into the Caribbean, very predictable. You know where they're going. They tend to be the very big, strong ones and will affect you. Interestingly, this year, we have been noticing a lot of moisture coming in from the Pacific in the upper atmosphere. So you tend to have a lot of these high clouds over us. It just makes the day look rather gloomy, no rain out of it, but it's moisture coming in from the Pacific in the upper atmosphere. And in fact, that is what we have right now. And a tropical wave came in last night, passing through us right now. And those two things triggered the rain we had today. In fact, when you look at the computer models in the Pacific right now, those systems are still there producing a lot of these high-level clouds. And interestingly, it seems that some of these may drift into the Central America and over Yucatan this weekend into Monday. And something could form out of it as we go into the early part of next week, right offshore us. So indeed, we could have an interesting opening of the hurricane season next week.
Wow.
I don't know if interesting was the word I was choosing just now. I thought that story was leading to good news, that the Pacific clouds were going to keep everything away.
Interesting. It seems that they want to pay us a visit. But again, it's very early, and anything can occur out of it. It could just be a lot more rain, and nothing actually forms out of it. But indeed, it does seem we're going to be having some significant rainfall over the weekend as this system drifts into the Yucatan.
Carlos, I think one of the things that we have all observed, and we don't need any science background to be able to verify this, that we've seen changing weather patterns in our country. You're talking about droughts, you're talking about less cold air coming down, less rains, lots of heat. When you put all of these things into consideration, what does it say about what our traditional hurricane seasons and the expectations we usually have with those patterns, are those changing as well?
Absolutely. In fact, the latest research that came out a couple of weeks ago verifies what people were sensing. We're having many more strong hurricanes than we ever had before. So the data, we now have enough data from the past hurricane seasons to indicate that indeed hurricanes are stronger than they used to be before. There is still no indication yet about the number of hurricanes. That is still debatable, but the number of strong hurricanes is increasing compared to the weaker ones. Secondly, everything is showing us again, and there is consensus on it, hurricanes have more water in it than they had before. So they tend to, because of the warm atmosphere, the hurricanes themselves produce more rain than they ever did before.
Is this?
And then
you were going with finally, go ahead.
And the other thing is that the patterns of movement tend to be more erratic now. We saw what occurred last year over the Bahamas, where this hurricane just sat over an island
there,
for
yeah.
like 3 days. Yeah, and that because what occurred to us with Keith back, was it in 1999, 2000, with Hurricane Keith over San Pedro, and Kikauker again for 3 days. Yeah, so indeed we're seeing much more of these than we ever had before.
Is this a direct result of climate change?
Absolutely, climate change is now a factor in it. And so because of the warmer atmosphere and warmer oceans, and we know now that 90% of the extra energy because of global warming goes into the ocean, not into the atmosphere. So while we are feeling all this heat, you're only feeling 10% of what is actually occurring in the ocean.
And then a question here. So we always, yes, we go through the hurricane season, but one of the scariest thing about the hurricane season is that there's a peak. What causes a hurricane peak, a hurricane season peak? And why is there a peak?
Well, again, all these conditions that I mentioned before don't occur simultaneously. They gradually build up during the year. And so that is why as June comes around, you may get one or two. And as the oceans get warmer and warmer, because don't forget, we have not actually begun the official summer season yet for the northern hemisphere. We're still into spring, going into summer. Okay. And so as summer comes along, because the sun is now directly over us, that is when you get more heat coming in, and the atmosphere and the ocean takes a while to respond to that energy coming in. The heat then builds up, and that is what then triggers the peak of the hurricane season, which really occurs on the 10th of September, interestingly for us.
Wow. I know, right? I know. I also wanted to know if weather is trendy. And I'm saying this because I had a fisherman uncle, and he would just look at the weather. He would feel the atmosphere, and he could tell you, what, I'm not going fishing because the north wind is about to come in the next few hours. That's going to do bad for fishing. So is weather trendy? Are people, and will it continue to be like that, especially because of climate change?
Well, first of all, I would not refer to it as trendy. In fact, we now recognize that local communities and indigenous peoples have an inherent knowledge about weather and climate. And they are using a holistic approach to how they look at the weather, while scientists, trained meteorologists, are very principled, having these very dogmatic principles that we follow to come up with our conclusions. While we are now recognizing that indigenous peoples and local communities have this knowledge that is passed down to them traditionally. And we're now trying to see how we can capture both sides, because indeed they can both contribute for a better understanding of these weather patterns. So we have to recognize that farmers, fishermen, people who live off the land, really know what they're seeing. They know about planting dates inherently from the flora and the fauna and what the animals are doing around them, how the land is feeling. So indeed, they have that knowledge inbred in them that has passed down from them from generation to generation orally. And we're now trying to figure out how to capture that kind of information. Unfortunately, climate change may actually affect that traditional passage of knowledge, because indeed things are changing. And so climate change may actually affect how that traditional knowledge is passed along from one generation to the next.
Wow. Wow.
And now, when we pay attention to what's happening on the other side of the world and the cyclones, which they monitor, they've been seeing stronger storms as well. Is it just a general adaptation or I should just say change, that is taking place, that there's a strengthening in some of these natural disasters?
Absolutely. Once again, the hurricanes and in the Pacific, they may be known as tropical cyclones, typhoons, or whatever. They're the same systems. Again, they're seeing the more intense systems also over there. Just this past week in the Bay of Bengal, we had a very strong one. However, what is very gratifying to note is that when it made landfall, it did not produce the kind of deaths that we saw in 1970. 1970, another storm, hurricane, went the same path and produced over 500,000 casualties in Bangladesh and India. So indeed, luckily we now have good warning systems and good response systems that allow people to actually evacuate the areas. So while things are getting stronger, at least our response is now improving significantly.
And that's especially for us in Belize. We know since we've had the Doppler radar, we've been able to get a bird's eye view of systems as they approach or pass in front of Belize. How does that change, you think, just the level of preparation that we have and the mitigation of the risks of loss of life?
Absolutely. In fact, I think Belizeans are now one of the most hurricane-ready nations in the world.
Wow.
We certainly learned from what occurred for us in 1931, when in fact there was no satellite, no aircraft, no radar. To 1961, in fact, 61 was the year when we first launched, the first satellite that was launched. And Hattie was one of the first hurricanes that was actually seen on a weather satellite. And since then, we have developed a very effective meteorological service with state-of-the-art Doppler and satellite receiving systems and telecommunication systems and good weather observations from around the country using automatic weather stations and weather balloons and so on. So indeed, we are an integral factor of the monitoring system, which we send to the Hurricane Center in Miami, which then compiles all this data from around the various platforms, figures out the warning system, which we then modify based on our national circumstances to warn our population. We now have an active NEMO that indeed has prepared the country, and I've heard them for the past 2 weeks already on radio and TV, advising people to get ready for the hurricane season. And I think especially because of what we're going through right now, this is when you really need to have that family action plan.
Yes.
Because indeed. With the restrictions on the number of people we should be getting together and the social distancing of 6 feet. Indeed, you want to be able to hunker down in your own house in the event that we were to be faced with one of these threats.
Yeah.
I'm so glad you mentioned that this was a conversation I think we had last week, just kind of putting into context what hurricane planning is going to look like in the middle of a pandemic. Because you're right, there are things like social distancing that have to be taken into consideration. There is loss of income, so some people can't prepare the way they used to. From your experience and from what you've seen in other parts of the world, how have they managed with that? Because hurricane planning is very similar throughout.
Absolutely. So in fact, the areas that have been affected by COVID or by hurricanes in the past couple of weeks have not had the huge pandemic. So, for example, as you know, Australia did very early action, and they have not been affected very much by the COVID, and so they were able to take the necessary actions. Bangladesh, again, they have not been having that huge outbreak we've been having in other areas. So, in fact, we may be one of the first areas where, with limited areas to move, at least our islands, we are going to be almost the guinea pigs of what you need to do properly to prepare for such an onslaught.
Yeah.
Wow.
I know no one wants to think of preparing for hurricanes in the season, but if we just look at what's happened to Caribbean nations or Caribbean brothers and sisters just in the past few years, we know that the effects are devastating and they linger for so long. The other observation, I think, I'm trying to remember, was it Maria and Irma? The two category 5s that came back to back, they affected the Eastern Caribbean.
That's right, Dominica, Barbuda.
Yes. Yeah.
Indeed. Yeah, very serious thing. The fortunate thing for Belize is that we are able to move inland.
Yeah.
As you know, 90% of the people who lose their lives lose it because of a storm surge. Water is the big killer in a hurricane. And we do have the landmass. We can evacuate our islands. We can move inland, moving away from the sea, but also moving away from the rivers, also to go to high dry land and avoid that water. That is the big killer, and I think we are able to do that.
You know, you mentioned, funny enough, you mentioned moving away from the rivers. It reminds me of Tropical Depression 16, which some referred to as a 100-year storm. What I'd like for us to do at this particular point, while we've got folks watching, can you give us the from what to hurricane? Because I feel, I think some of these like for the phases, I think for the most part, some people might take them for granted. When you hear, oh, it's only a tropical storm, oh, it's only a tropical depression, man, but they're all dangerous alike. Can you tell us about these?
Certainly. So the typical way these systems will form, we get like 100 tropical waves cross the Atlantic Ocean from Africa every year, passing through, and that is what produces our rains during the rainy season. About 100 of them. Of those, typically a few of them would develop into a tropical depression, and a tropical depression is merely an area of low pressure that has a small amount of circulation in it, but winds are no more than 30 miles an hour. So, and that would not produce any significant damage, but they are very disorganized, so they tend to have a lot of rainfall, and if they're moving very slowly, indeed, they can then just drench you totally, which is what occurred with Tropical Depression 16. It is not a windstorm, it is a rainmaker. And if you are in a valley and the rain is occurring up in the mountains, all that water then rushes down into the lowest area. As you know, water will find the lowest point and head towards it. And so that is what occurred in this Tanquik Valley with Tropical Depression 16, when all that water came down and washed out these people. And indeed, when we speak about a 100-year storm, that is an engineering term for engineers when they design systems. And they would then ask the person, well, do you want me to design this bridge to last 100 years? Then I need to take the 100-year storm into account. But if it's going to be a system to last 500 years, then I will take the 500-year storm into account, because it is possible that you'll get 5 100-year storms in 500 years. So you don't want to design it for the 100-year storm. So it is just a way of convincing the stakeholders, this is what you need to prepare for as you're building a system. And so indeed, it was a very intense rainfall event that produced that 100-year storm. Now, when winds exceed the 25 or 30 mile an hour area, but does not go beyond 39 miles per hour, it is then a tropical storm. You get winds now, indeed, are stronger, but they are no more than 40 miles per hour. And that it is at that point that the Hurricane Center then puts a name on a system.
Okay. Yeah.
It becomes a tropical storm, Arthur, once it is a tropical storm. A center is denoted, it is well defined, and the rain bands are now much more visible, and you can actually see a center and begin to track it properly. A tropical depression, the center is hard to find. A storm, you're now being able to see that.
Yeah.
Once the winds are now between 40 miles an hour and 74 miles per hour, so that is then the tropical storm. Sorry, it is 40 to 75 miles per hour is a tropical storm. A tropical depression is up to 39 miles per hour.
Okay.
And then we know it moves through the categories.
Of hurricanes, yeah. Once it exceeds 74 miles per hour, up to 95, category 1, then 2, 3, 4, and 5, and anything above 155 miles per hour is then a category 5 hurricane.
And see, that was the point I wanted to get at. I remember growing up, we've all, as Belizeans, we know and hear of hurricanes our entire life, at least the threat of hurricanes.
Yeah.
And it used to be a rarity when you'd hear a Category 5. I mean, I remember just feeling paralyzed by fear with Mitch being a Category 5. Thankfully never made landfall in Belize. And now it's so much more frequent. And I'm trying to remember the specific storm. I won't bother naming it because I'll probably be wrong. But there was one that had exceeded, it was one of the highest on records in the Caribbean, or one that had impacted one of the islands. So we know that even the current categories that we're defining for even Category 5, we're seeing storms that exceed those wind speeds.
Oh, absolutely. And when it was designed, and in fact, the persons who actually came up with categories was a wind engineer and director of the Hurricane Center in Miami to try to tell people what to expect from a hurricane. Because somebody going through a Category 1, 75 miles per hour compared to something at 160 is a big difference.
Yeah.
And so this was a way of trying to tell people, look, this is kind of the impacts to expect from this system. And so indeed, it was never foreseen to have a category above Category 5 because any a design system, a very strong building would have withstood anything above 155 miles per hour. Mm-hmm. Now, maybe wind engineers need to look at that to see does a building, would you change the way you would design a building for 200 miles per hour compared to 160 miles per hour? I don't know, and maybe that is something now that now needs to be looked at.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. So we've seen more Category 5s, but not only that, we've seen them rapidly progressing or increasing in intensity. So you'd start off, one day you hear it's Category 1 or 2 and you feel like a blink of an eye, it's Category 5. Yeah. I'm exaggerating clearly, but that's how fast it feels. So this is also a major threat when you look at just how hurricane systems are changing as time goes by.
Absolutely, and in fact, that is one of the things that indeed we now recognize happening. When I was in school, for example, we knew that a system, it would take a day to go from a tropical depression to a tropical storm, another day storm to hurricane, another day from 1 to 2, and so indeed, it took you like maybe 7 days to go from a depression up to a Category 5 hurricane. We have seen them occurring overnight. In fact, Keith was one of those examples, going from a depression to Category 4 within basically 24 hours offshore Belize. Yeah. And so we're seeing that now. And one of the systems we now have in place to try to capture that is that we recognize it is when this system goes over a very warm pool of water that triggers that rapid intensification. And so the U.S. Weather Service now launches these drifting buoys, really small submarines that go in autonomous to track where these warm pools are ahead of the hurricane as they project where the hurricane is going to go in the next 24 hours. And they try to launch these very small submersible gliders into the water ahead of it to see if they can detect these warm pools, to see if that would indicate this rapid intensification. It's sort of like the flying drones we have now. Yeah. They also have submersible ones now to do the same thing.
Yeah. What causes the forecast track? What steers the hurricane or the storm? We have what we would refer to as rivers of air in the atmosphere. The same way we have rivers, in the sea or currents in the oceans. We have these currents in the atmosphere that actually is what moves these systems. So we have what we call the Bermuda High system over Bermuda in the Atlantic. Is quasi-stationary, always there. And so you tend to have systems then forming south of it in the Atlantic, in the Caribbean, and they move from east to west. And as they go around the western part of that Atlantic high, they then start to turn northwards towards Florida, and then they recurve and head back out to sea around that big high-pressure system. Mm-hmm. So that is the typical climatological movement of systems. However, we also have transitory systems like upper level troughs that move across the U.S.
that would then either pull it further west or further east, and then and change the trajectory of that somewhat.
Yeah. Huh. So when we look at what we have been seeing in the hurricane seasons, I wanted to ask, what are some of the recommendations now in terms of being able to prepare or build in a way to withstand just the intensity that we're seeing with hurricanes? I remember a long time ago, we were talking about kind of returning to our roots, going on stilted houses again for storm surges, and so it's kind of a rethink of what we used to do before.
Absolutely. And in fact, I would say the first thing that we really need to do is proper land use planning. Mm-hmm. That is where it is that you're going to build your house for the long term. And we know that the most vulnerable areas would be on the Keys and along the coast. So obviously, if you're going to build anything there, you need to have your structure high enough up from the water to allow the storm surge to pass under it.
Yeah.
So whether that's in the Keys or on the mainland, and even when you're building on the coastline or at the Keys, there's also a natural sand dune that is built up by the natural tides over the years. Mm-hmm. And you should really build behind that sand dune, because that sand dune also provides you with the first line of protection, because that absorbs most of that energy from it. So that is certainly one of them. Again, when you build your home, of course, you want to build it properly. If it's wooden, you need to put in ties from your posts, anchor your roof to the pillars. Yeah. Again, using hurricane straps and that sort of thing, properly anchored all your systems in. Yeah. The typical roof, if it's going to be sheet metal, should have a hip roof, and that is the sharper the angle of your roof, the less likelihood it is going to be to lift off, because that is how you usually have structural damage on your building, because the roof rips away and then everything starts to fall apart. Yeah. So you really want to have a steep angle on your roof. With hurricane shutters properly, and actually from the outside in, and that is, I mean, by fastening the shutters from the outside, and the wind blows against that shutter, it makes the shutter stronger.
Okay.
While if you have it from the inside, indeed, you're then allowing those nails to easily come off, because then they have no way of, nothing is holding it in. So yeah. Indeed, you really want to put all those things in place.
Yeah. Yeah, these all make a lot of sense. I think, naturally we have to start thinking ahead of how we're going to prepare, or at least have homes that will be more resilient to what we're seeing. John asked a question about forecasts and the predicted paths, and I think that this is a great time to kind of get a head start on the education on it. We saw in one of the previous storms where the storm surge came in Ladyville. It didn't make landfall in Ladyville. And we saw where, we had the desperation of people trying to get out of their houses. They didn't know how high the water was going to raise. And I remember having a conversation after that we need to look at the cone and understand it properly in terms of the impacts that it may have. It's not about kind of the specific pinpoint that we look at. It's more looking at the wider range. Do you want to go ahead and explain that for us?
Certainly. So in the case, and that was Hurricane Earl a few years ago, when the center actually, I believe, passed either over or just south of Belize City. But in fact, Ladyville was in the northern eye wall, which is the strongest part of a hurricane. And with the wind coming in from the east, it drove all that water into that natural bay that is where Ladyville is in.
Yeah.
Because as you know, Belize City is actually a peninsula, and then it dips in towards the Ladyville area and back out. So all that water accumulated into this bay and then pushes water on land. And so in fact, Ladyville is a very prone area, a very vulnerable area for storm surges. So even though it was a strong Category 1 hurricane, it did push something like 6 feet of water into the Ladyville area, and indeed threatened many homes. Indeed. So as you're absolutely right, we have to look at the extent of the hurricane force winds, because that is where you're going to have the strongest winds and the strongest storm surge. Yeah. And the storm surge is always going to be highest in the northern part of a hurricane, because that is where the wind is coming in from the east, bringing in water from the east. Whereas on the southern part of the hurricane, the wind is actually from the land out to sea, and the storm surge is going to be less, obviously. In fact, the water may actually go out to sea because the land wind is pushing the water out. Yeah. And so you really have to look at where the center is making landfall to be able to predict, whether you're going to have a storm surge or not, and how high that storm surge is. But obviously, we cannot, no one can yet predict with any certainty where the center of a hurricane is going to make landfall. Yeah. We have made excellent progress right now, and in fact, our 24-hour error on landfall is now something like 60 miles. So even 24 hours before a hurricane makes landfall, we know it's going to be between either within a 60-mile range. Mm-hmm. So for us, that is anywhere between Belize City and Curacao Town. Between Belize City and Dangriga, taking a look at that. So that is why we always tell people, don't look at where the center of that thing is going to be. Obviously, you have to assume it's going to be over you. And if you're outside of that cone, indeed, then you can maybe start to take your guard down. But once you're in that cone, expect it to affect you. Yeah. And if it does, you're ready. If it doesn't, you say, thank goodness, I escaped the brunt of it.
I hear you.
I think if we put it back into perspective of current times, what this pandemic has taught us is that what seemed to be a far-fetched idea, a pandemic every 100 years, in fact, does pan out to be true. And I don't think any one of us living through this experience ever thought we'd see the day that something like this would happen. Yeah. And it's also true for hurricanes. I know we've talked so much about being spared, but it doesn't mean that that's a permanent status that we get to keep, especially for Belize City.
Absolutely, and I will always recall any person who lived through the 1931 or 61 Hattie, who went through the brunt of it, will always be the first to tell you hurricanes are nothing to play with. Now, others who have been on the periphery of one of these systems will say, oh, well, I went through that hurricane. Yes, but you did not go through the brunt of it, and so you can speak that way. And so, indeed, we really have to listen when we hear people speaking about the impacts of a hurricane. And in fact, I always recall the late Bishop Wright, having lost all his family through it, was one of the most serious advocates of preparedness and of heeding warnings.
Yeah. I don't think a lot of people know how traumatic it was for Bishop Wright. I think it was Hattie. It was Hurricane Hattie, where he lost his family and he clung on for life. And rode out the storm. And you're right. My mom experienced Hattie, and I know when she hears hurricane, it's about action. It's not about thinking or thinking twice. It's about moving and being safe as fast as possible.
I think that's one of the reasons why NEMO will keep telling people, make your plan now while your head is clear.
Yeah.
Because when it's time to take action, it's not the time now to think, well, what should I do? Should I go or not go? Or should I buy this or buy that? No, you've already thought it out. You have your checklist, and you can then, taking action.
Yeah.
Too many people, as you know, will wait until the last minute and then rush to buy things, to put in gas, to try to do many things at the same time, and you end up actually creating problems because of the traffic jams, and the supermarkets are clogged up and so on.
Yeah.
Wow.
Well, I think if we take a cue from what we've done with COVID-19, when we shut down and locked down because we wanted to prevent the worst, and so we came out with just only 18 cases. We did lose 2 lives, but it certainly wasn't the worst case scenario that we'd feared for. So we did the work then, and I think we could do the same practice in the hurricane season. If we're asked to move, move. If we come back home and nothing happened, that's why we did it.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think maybe that has prepared us properly for the hurricane season. Because as you said, I recall when we were first launching these shutdowns and so on, supermarkets got swamped, and police had to put in lines in place and so on. Now, as we're living it, people are taking their time. We're still on the same measures, but you're no longer seeing that mad rush. People know that every 4 or 5 days, I need to top up a bit more to keep going.
Yeah.
And if we keep that same system in place for the hurricane season, we should even weather it out quite well this year.
All right. Anything in terms of your advice to Belizeans when we hear above average? This is for the entire region, but of course, it only takes one to really have devastating effects on our country.
Absolutely. So, in fact, what the U.S. Weather Service is predicting this year, we're going to have something like 13 to 19 storms. Normally, we have 12. 6 to 10 hurricanes. Normally, we have 6. And 3 to 6 major hurricanes. Normally, we have 3. And those are categories 3, 4, and 5. And trust me, when somebody would say it's only a 3 compared to a 5, a 3 is to me as bad as a 5. You don't want to be staying around for anything above a category 2 hurricane. You move out.
Yeah. And that you mean for Belize City or all of the coast?
All the coast, yes. We're talking about storm surge, significant storm surge now. Yeah. Anything between 10 to 15 feet of water, you don't want to be in that. Yeah. That is like a bulldozer hitting your house.
I could imagine. Well, Carlos Fuller, thank you so very much. I'll tell you what, we learned a lot today.
Yeah.
And it's always nice to hear from you, sir. Thank you so very much.
Thank you very much for having me, and have a pleasant day.
Oh, wow. Speaking of hurricanes, I could just hear the winds again of Hurricane Earl, and that was devastating to us just to hear it. But nonetheless, we need to take a break. When we come back, we will be talking to some youths about youth and mental health and COVID-19. So stay with us. We'll be right back.
This COVID update was brought to you by Fulltech Systems, your technology center, where you'll come for the price, but stay for the service.